This is Charles Mann, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
I always love when you come on. We have fantastic conversations about, things that we think versus things as they are.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about pre-Columbian history and a bunch of things like that. One of the things I love to bring up when I talk to people is I'll say, we are so wealthy that we make our human bowel movements into potable water, simply push a button and never think about it again. It's like it's the height of decadence if you look in terms of all of human history. And you examine this in your articles that you're releasing now on the New Atlantis site. So I'd love to talk about these thoughts about the difference between how things were, how they are, and how systems work within that approach to either improve or whatever. So when we use an example like that, putting potable water in our front yard, that we then go back and fertilize, on top of that, it's just like, these are insane things, but we don't see it. We don't realize how very fortunate we are.
Yeah, it's if you think of just our ancestors from 50 years ago or 70 years ago, just think about the things that we don't have. And, most people think about things like, electric cars or LED light bulbs or the internet or what have you. But the real thing that we have is in almost everywhere in the world, we have access to safe drinking water. Almost everywhere in the world, most people have enough to eat. Almost everywhere in the world, most people have electricity. And it just goes on, these basic things. That means that people can walk into their homes in the dark, switch on a light, go out and get a drink of water, know they won't die, and then open the refrigerator, right? The little light comes on, and there's something that they can eat that's probably not contaminated. And this was just not something that was available to anyone 100 years ago, and even to most of us 50 years ago. So, obviously there are things that we want to improve about it. Obviously there are things that we can do better, but the sheer progress that we've made is just absolutely enormous. And it gives us also a kind of responsibility, which is to maintain all that effort that our ancestors did to bring us here and not screw it up for them.
Right. Yeah.
We screwed up our descendants.
Right. Yeah. Essentially here in the States, we have a universal aqueduct. Mm-hmm. That is both fresh and wastewater, and look, how many people even think about gray water versus black? We don't ever consider it. It's a remarkable thing. When my baseball talking friends and I talk, they'll often take a modern player and say, if they played back in Babe Ruth's time, I'd be like, it's a 1 in 4 chance they wouldn't have survived 20 years old. 1 in 4, that's crazy when you think about that. And that's to 18. Now you got to get to 30. And again, a big reaping happens because of that. You constant access to lead in our medicine, in our food, constant access to mercury, a lot of just lard in the diet. It wasn't a very healthy diet, right? So these folks look older, premature compared to what we think now, but they were exposed to so many harder things, lead in the paint, lead on everything. And again, when you encounter someone who is getting further away from your parents, my parents, great-grandparents, my great-great-grandfather came here from Sweden, one of them. Mm-hmm. And they had to try to drain a swamp just to survive and maybe get their crop in the ground if it survived the Minnesota weather.
Mm-hmm. Or just imagine, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest where they had absolutely huge trees. And one time when I was a kid, I was talking to my father and I was asking him how they cut down all those trees. Because we would go out and see the remains where we're there. There were cedars that were, 8 feet across and so forth, and go with an axe. And I remember as a kid trying to chop down a much smaller tree than that with an axe. And it would just take you all day to cut down one tree. It was remarkable, the kinds of things that we have and what we have now and how blind we are to it. And in fact, that's the sort of general purpose of the articles that I've written. I like to call it my first piece of overt political propaganda, which is to say, hey guys, our ancestors did all these things for us, and it's up to us to keep them going and to make them better. And I just think that sometimes when I read the newspaper, we're kind of losing the ball. We're taking our eye off the ball, to use another baseball metaphor. And we're not paying attention to the fact that we have these roads. These roads need to be maintained. We have these power grids. These power grids need to be upgraded. We have these water systems. They need to, they're constantly wearing out. They need to be fixed. And we have this amazing agricultural and public health systems on which we all depend. And I wish that we were paying more attention to them.
So your first piece sort of opens the whole conversation. You talk about Thomas Jefferson and ink and his wine collection, and you're sitting with a bunch of younger folks at a wedding. I guess maybe compare and contrast a little bit Thomas Jefferson's world to some lovely, beautiful young couple off on their life adventure. What's the difference there?
Well, this all started really, as I said, I'm writing a book and I've been reading about Thomas Jefferson, and I was reading some of his letters. And in one of them, he complains that he says, "It was so cold in my study that I couldn't write to you because the ink froze in my pen." And this is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was an amazing guy, but among other things, he was a very wealthy guy by the standards of his time. I mean, he had the biggest wine cellar in the United States. He had this huge private library that became the basis for the Library of Congress. He had this, immense estate, Monticello, that he developed and built himself. He was a wealthy guy, and even in his office, it was so cold that he couldn't write letters. And a few days after that, I went to my college roommate's, son's destination wedding, which is on a beautiful little island off of the Pacific Northwest, pretty remote in terms of, anything else. And there's 150 people there, could just parachute in there. And we had this beautiful electric lights, this great meal, lots of places to stay. Everybody's warm and cozy, this gorgeous view. And I thought, it's amazing to think that we could do this. I mean, middle-class people can afford to do this, not every day, but, sometimes for a wedding. And none of this was possible in Jefferson's day. Not one bit of it. Every person there was richer than Thomas Jefferson. And then as it struck me, and I was talking to the kids were great. I don't want to, say anything about them. They're just great. And they're all full of enthusiasm about, their lives and making the world better and helping people and so forth. And I sort of remarked, isn't it amazing that you can do all this? And it had never occurred to them. And the point is not so much that, kids these days are dumb. It's that we're all dumb. It wasn't until Thomas Jefferson, I was reading Thomas and Jefferson, that it occurred to me. I can't hardly blame them, right? And I just thought, dang, we should be learning about this in school. This should be like a civics class, how the systems that we depend on work and how they got built and what our responsibility is towards them. And so this series is kind of my first stab at imagining what I would want to teach those high school kids.
Right. We'll often say, don't take these things for granted. And actually, we'll say granite, like The Rock will say, don't take that for granted. And then you realize they're saying granted. And then you realize, but it is granted. Who's going to say having a public toilet is that like these things they're granted. It's been done. And as to your point, these earlier generations have built a massive plumbing system. They've built a water system, financial systems. Right before we talked, one of my clients, his name's Herb, wonderful dude. He and his friends are all in the financial real estate business. And they take the wealth that someone accrues in their house. We're going to sell this house. And it's like, well, here's how you protect that wealth. And you can become, by any other standard, really around the rest of the world, fantastically wealthy. You've got this $800,000 nut because you sold your parents' house. and now you get to transfer that wealth into these other and multiply it. Oh my God. Like this wasn't, and still in a lot of places is not possible because the financial systems don't work equally in every place. And so it's a fantastic premise to have us think about what it takes to maintain the granted thing, but also how do you reliably build a system that improves the quality of living without, because diminishing returns, all these other things matter. How much do you work on the forward aspect? Like, hey, what should we do next? Okay, we appreciate what you're saying, but when we go forward, we got to agree and pick the right things reliably.
So this is a really excellent question, and I kind of wish it was something that was part of the public discussion. I mean, that's essentially you're asking that question is kind of the whole point of my article. Not so much to tell people what to do, but to say that's our job. Is we need to keep it going, we need to improve it, and we need to balance it with all the other systems that we have. And so the first article in the series after the introduction is about agriculture and the sheer fact that when I was growing up, when I was in high school, and the United Nations issued, the Food and Agriculture Organization issued one of these sort of state of the planet type reports, and they sent out people and they systematically surveyed as best they could everybody in the world, and they said, 1970, which is 55 years ago, 40% of the world didn't get enough to eat at some point during the year. They were, undernourished, I think was their term. Didn't mean they're hungry all the time, but it meant some point during the year, 4 out of 10 people on the planet didn't have enough for breakfast or lunch or dinner, which is an astonishing and terrible thing, because it means, stunted growth, it means hunger, it means misery, it means political instability, it means just about everything bad that you can imagine. Now, here's the incredible thing. Since then, in those 55 years, the world's population has more than doubled, almost tripled. It went from 3 billion to 8.2 billion, right? So many more mouths, yet the number of hungry people just fell off a cliff. And now it's something on the order of 8 or 9%. And almost all of that hunger is not caused, as it was, by insufficient harvests and farmers not being able to grow enough, but it's almost all caused by political instability and war and all these terrible things that you read about in the newspaper. So the situation has dramatically changed. That basically sometime in the 1980s, the average person on Earth had enough to eat for the first time in history, so far as we're aware of. And this is this huge transition, right? We're able to feed ourselves for the first time in recorded history. And again, I think this should be something that is taught in the schools. Hey guys, this is a big deal.
Yeah. There's a number of things to cover within that, but I'll just say, I live here in California. I grew up right here in the pivot between the Delta and the Central Valley and the Bay Area. So I was right there. And we've mastered all of that water. Look, there's some places where it's not 100% mastered, but the Central Valley is, for the most part, never beset by floods. We have great water control. And look, could we improve? Absolutely. But we don't have the problems that you had 100 years ago. When you read about Sherman on his horse, not riding in Civil War, but 10, 15 years prior out in California, riding around as an officer, he's encountering all these things, and it was a wild land. It's not that way anymore. It's developed in a way that allows us to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, bread baskets in the world. I had this wonderful PhD professor on my show. She looked at how food moved, and there's systems within that, right? And then there's the efficiencies are built over time. And the way that we move a lot of our food is on trucks, but also on barges. Those barges rely on locks. Those locks have to be maintained, and also could be a target. And so you start to realize, like, wow, I never think about any of this, like the fact that potatoes come from wherever they come from, or the fact that right now you and I can both agree, even though we don't live in this, we live in the opposite sides of the nation. We could say, hey, let's order some Giordano's from, or whatever, Lou Malnati's from Chicago, have deep dish sent to our homes, and we're going to watch a game together.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mind-blowing how like, we just have no idea what it takes to make all those things happen, and yet they happen all the time. Keep going.
Okay. So, I'm seeing a thing saying battery exhausted on your end.
Yeah, I got that covered.
Okay, great. So
keep the convo
this all happened relatively recently, and this is because in those 55 years that we're talking about, 3 things happened. One is that we started irrigating a lot more, and irrigating doesn't mean just that you provide water, but it means you provide water in controlled amounts. And so places like what you're talking about, like the Central Valley, places like the Southwest, places like a ton of the Middle West now have reliable water, which means you can optimize the crops. So irrigation, very old technology, but it advanced, and the reason was cheap energy. You add fossil fuels, and suddenly all those pumps and all that water system becomes tenable. So that's huge. Right. 40% of the world's crops are grown by irrigation. And so even though it's an ancient technology, we got to put it on, put it up in hyperdrive in the last 50 years. The second one is fertilization. And people, again, have known about fertilization, putting manure or what they call night soil on your crops. But the reason for fertilization to do this is that it provides nitrogen for crops. And the nitrogen is needed because it's the essential constituent for photosynthesis. If you don't have nitrogen, you don't have enough photosynthesis, you don't have enough photosynthesis, you don't have a plant growing. But there's nitrogen all over, the world. 3/4 of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but it's not in a form that plants can absorb. So you got to put it in what they call, an available form. And that's what fertilizer does. But shipping manure around, not so easy. So,
yeah.
So what happened was, around the First World War, two German chemists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, figured out a way to make synthetic ammonia, which is chemical formula is nitrogen and hydrogen, NH3, and that's the building block for making artificial fertilizer. And that's fertilizer you can put in a factory, put in, big tanker truck and send it out. Super powerful fertilizer. And the amount of fertilizer just completely explodes right after the Second World War. First and Second World War kind of interrupt things. And it is, I can't tell you how much of a change it is. There's a great scientist, a geoscientist named Vaclav Smil up in Canada. And Smil has calculated that the very crudely, fertilizer is responsible for about 40% of the protein in the human body all over the world. So something like 40% of us are alive because these two German chemists, most people have never heard of, invented how to do this fertilizer. And so you have this massive fertilizer industry, uses about 1% of the world's electric energy, and that energy feeds us all,
So
and
crazy.
So you add irrigation, and then you add fertilizer, already huge. And then this is the most well-known part of this, but it's still not very well known, if you know what I mean. It's the least unknown, I guess. Is a guy, an effort led by a guy named Norman Borlaug, Nobel Prize winner in 1970. And what he did was he developed in Mexico after the Second World War, working for the Rockefeller Foundation, wheat that essentially can take advantage of lots and lots of water and lots of fertilizer and be super productive. And you add these three things together, lots of irrigation, lots of fertilizer, and these new seeds, and you get what's been called the Green Revolution. All over the world, wheat yields doubled, tripled, even quadrupled. And then people saw what you'd done for wheat, and they said, hey, let's do the same thing for rice. And outfit called IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, was set up again with Ford and Rockefeller behind it, and they created super rice. And the boom that you see in Asia, now we think of Asia as a relatively wealthy part of the world, East Asia. That's before 1970, when we were talking about, that was the center of the world's poverty. I grew up. My parents said to me, "There are starving kids in Asia, right? Eat your mashed potatoes, right?" They were right. There were starving kids in Asia. Now, not nearly so true. Sure, still plenty of people that are poor, but the dramatic changes you see in Asia, going to a place like Bangkok with these super modern skyscrapers, going to any place in Southeast Asia like that, or China, is all based on the fact that this explosion in the food supply. When people aren't hungry all the time, they can start turning their attention to other things.
Yeah.
And when people aren't, eking out a living in the soil, they can, go out and do other things like inventing things or building things or becoming, Korean pop stars or whatever they want to do, right? And
Right.
so these are just fundamental changes in the human condition that are like nothing before. And it
Right.
builds this enormous agricultural system. And with it comes this explosion in transportation. So you have these giant companies like Cargill and so forth. I'll never forget going to Mato Grosso in Brazil a few years ago, probably 10 years ago now. And that's one of the soy centers of the world. And seeing all these international companies, out what to me seemed like the middle of nowhere, and these trucks thundering out with all the soy going to China, going to Europe, going to other parts of South America. And, that stuff is happening all over the world. And most of us aren't really aware of it because they're so good at their jobs.
Yeah, boy, again, like there's so many things to mention. I guess I'll pick this first one.
Mm-hmm.
I had a doctor, physical doctor, like a medical doctor on the show with a co-author. And the thing that they came up with, you said night soil earlier, that's poop, everybody. There was so much poop around all of us before. Again, back to the sewer thing. And so when all of the rash of presidents and people in the White House that were dying, they were bathing in water that was downhill from the nightshade deposit. So you had horses and other things pooping in the street all the time. You had people had to pick buckets of poop and take it to the poop dump, and none of this was being reliably processed into anything other than just dump it by the river or next to the river
into the river.
Yeah. And so now little Willie Lincoln is taking a bath in water that comes downstream from that, and he has no chance, right? And so not only have we reduced the amount of filth around us, look, there's still cholera outbreaks, but when was the last cholera outbreak in the United States or Canada? I mean, it essentially doesn't exist, right?
Here's another story for you. I just learned about this. So I live in Western Massachusetts, and recently I became aware that Calvin Coolidge, his presidential library is in Northampton. It's actually in the public library in Northampton. And so I was reading about Calvin Coolidge because I was curious. And in the 1920s, a terrible thing happened to him. While he was in the White House, his 16-year-old son went out to play tennis with some friends. And because he was a kid, he did something dumb, which is he didn't put socks on.
Right.
He just played without socks. He got a big blister on his toe. Ordinary thing for a kid to do, but the blister got infected and the kid died.
That was it.
This is, the President of the United States had the best medical care available to anyone in the world at that time.
Yeah.
And his kid gets a scratch on his toe, essentially, and dies. And that's just about, that's the worst thing that can happen to anyone, I think, is having a kid die. And it happened to him, and that's the world that he lived in.
That was the world. Well, my grandfather, around the same era, the 20s, early 30s, 3 of his brothers died within like 3 years of each other. One was an infant, and it was so common. They're like, "Oh yeah, we don't count that kid."
Yeah,
this kid was born, right? It didn't die at birth; it was living and alive. And they're like, "Yeah, that one died early."
Yeah,
but the other 2 died of appendicitis, which you can't die from today. Reliably, but they had no really weight. It was like, let's just see what happens. Was the approach? Make you comfortable and put you in the hospital. You talked about nitrogen
like that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just on a say. So we've lived in. My family has lived in mostly in New England for a long time in upstate New York, and so a long time ago, in the 19th century, they bought a family plot in Watkins Glen, New York, and that's where. If you ever go to Watkins Glen, you'll see a whole bunch of my family buried there. And so I was visiting, and a few years ago, and I realized that in one of the corners of the family plot was, my great uncle's, and he had 3 little kids who had died, before infancy, and they're all named Duncan. Because one had died after 3 weeks, and they said, "Oh God, we'll try again." Another one died after a year, and the third one made it to his teenagers. They had 3 kids named Duncan died. Yeah.
Horrible. Yeah. You talk about we get depressed and anxious now. Imagine having kids just, totally out of. I mean, you have to believe in God because what else could be doing all this stuff? It's I
Yeah.
wanted to get into
Sorry, sure. Yeah.
And when you talk about the access to poop and things like that, to turn that into energy, which actually use nitrogen to make bombs, right?
Yeah.
And so you have that. We had the folks from Monsanto come on the show because we often politically kind of get wrapped up and think Monsanto bad. And then the dude from Monsanto says, I understand. We purposely didn't get into like law cases because they can't talk about that stuff. Like, what do you guys do? And they're like, well, when farmers have problems they can't solve, we hire the best people in the world at farming. We hire all of them, PhD level people, and we solve problems all the time. And if we can solve it in a natural way, of course we do that. But when there is no other mechanism, then we look at the other higher in science things. And if we don't do that, people die.
Right.
And you're like, oh, fuck, what am I going to do? I can't. Look, they might be an evil corporation that does evil corporation things. Okay, no pass on that. But you're feeding people that can, because the only way to feed them is to design a crop, wheat, rice, flax, whatever it's going to be, that will survive in their environment, that'll be resistant to rust or all these other things. They do that. And farmers come to them. They go, hey, we need your help. And so they go, we solve farmer problems. But we don't like that. And this is part of that thing you're talking about. Right.
They do something. A few years ago, they were kind enough to invite me to come there and see some of their labs, and I had to sign an NDA and all that. Sure. But there's a couple things I can say. One is I never saw such a crew of talented young people there in their labs, just really inspiring. I mean, they were kids. They were in their 20s and 30s, but they were just, brilliant, hardworking kids who were really getting their hands dirty, solving problems that were going to affect people's lives. And one of the things that farmers all around the world have a problem with is that the fertilizer, nothing is perfect, right? And so there's a downside for everything. And a downside is for fertilizer, which has done so much for us, that a lot of the fertilizer doesn't get used. It gets whooshed off the soil and into the rivers, and then it goes into like the Gulf of Mexico or the North Sea or the Bay of Bengal. And what happens when that goes there? Fertilizer in the ocean is still fertilizer, and so it stimulates this enormous growth of all these plants and microorganisms. They fall down to the bottom, and then all kinds of other microorganisms eat them, and those microorganisms proliferate so much that they suck all the oxygen out of the water, and you get these large dead zones where fish can't go, and it's bad news. And the one in the Gulf of Mexico has something like 8,000 square miles. I mean, it's not tiny. And you also get this phenomenon of eutrophication, as they call it, where you get these lakes and rivers filled with algae and other stuff. So there's some real serious downsides to this. These are not made up ecological problems. These are real things. And then if you get too much fertilizer in the soil, you know how you can burn out things if you dump too much fertilizer in your potted plants? Yeah. You can do that to a whole farm if you're not careful, and it can wipe out the kind of soil microorganisms that we now know are so important. So overuse of fertilizer is a gigantic global environmental problem. And one of the things that they're doing at Monsanto to address this is to say, how can we make sure that we're put it on the amount you need in the time you need? And they're developing all these ways of scanning the fields and measuring the soil and doing that. Yeah. And the trick is, if you do this right, the farmers save money too. Not only do they do the right thing, but they save money because they don't overuse fertilizer. Because that fertilizer that gets whooshed off their soil, it's wasted. And, they're as thrifty as anybody else. Nobody likes to just waste stuff. Right. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that we can do. Yeah. Yeah. There's so many amazing things that are very, very, very modern. The pandemic killed this company off, but there was a company that was spraying on a, okay, this is going to get crazy, everybody. They're spraying on crops, a basically it's just a spray, but it's coded with like a cryptographic blockchain code system, so that if some guy in Salinas quaps a squat and poops on some romaine, you don't have to wipe out the entire romaine market. You can identify
by examining that spray and looking at like, oh, this is block 22, blah, 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 blah of this area. And the system can more accurately respond, you know? And so a lot of this stuff, yeah, it's amazing. They died, but that company died, but the technology still exists, right? We're learning how to better manage bees because bees are very smart. And so one of the things is by making these changes, by adding in ammonia and everything else into our, fertilizer pack, you know, we do get these new problems, but they are problems that are downstream from the other problem of people starving.
Right.
And so like we've solved that. So now we have to, how do we improve this system? How do we improve that system? One other thing to say about all this is, you know, when we build reservoirs, like our policies that are intended to like help the planet, it's very hard to reliably get that result. So we make reservoirs so everybody has access to water. All the things that you just described happening at the end of a delta all happen in a lake now because now there's more water there and there's more living things, and then they off gas methane, which is a horrible greenhouse gas. And so you're like, well, we need this water. And so we have these conundrums. And so now there's scientists, I think at Stanford, that are working on cracking methane into greenhouse gases that are less harmful than methane, but it takes a lot of energy to crack methane into something and capture it. Oh my gosh, you know, and so these things, the conundrums abound, really.
Right. Well, it's fortunately we're never going to run out of things to do and to solve. Yeah. But I think what we're talking about is essentially is progress, and I know that's a little bit how can I say, people don't, there's a certain part of the public that says, oh, everything's terrible. I hate this and I hate this. It's sort of, you see that both on the left and right. And I kind of wanted to write this to say, dude, there has been real progress and we're at the end of it. And yes, we have these problems, and they're real problems, but we also have these other ones that we don't have, in these kids that were at the wedding. They had student loans, they had super high rents, they had, all the problems of 20-year-olds today. But they didn't have to worry about dying from drinking water. They probably weren't going to
getting a blister,
or getting a blister, or starving themselves. They could.
Hell, we thrive so much on food that I got to eat macros. I can't just eat whatever I want because we're all getting too fat.
And and again, these are real problems, but it's really important for us to see how much we, how far we have come, because only by seeing that we see how important it is to maintain that. Because the other thing that this, as I told you, this is political propaganda I'm trying to push at you here. That all these systems and all this progress is only one generation away from falling apart. All we have to do is keep our eye off the ball for 10 or 20 years, and we can wreck things pretty seriously. And it'll be really hard to build them back up. And it's totally unnecessary if we just maintain them. There's the wonderful writer and thinker Stuart Brand is writing a big book now on maintenance, and it turns out that it's the subject that's absolutely huge, and we just don't think enough about. And it goes from things like, you can see it. One of his favorite examples he points to is that it's really hard to get people to give money to parks and schools and things like that, just to keep them going. They only want to build a new building so they can put their name on it. They don't want to keep all the existing good things going. And, now project that over an entire society. So again, my political propaganda, let's actually keep these good things going.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had a city manager on the show. He put out his plan and he's like, hey, listen, we don't make enough money. You guys are old. We have tax laws that don't allow us to get much of the money back. And so we're going to have to add things, or we're going to have to subtract from quality of life. And so I asked him an obvious question, like, hey, if a bunch of dudes said, hey, well, the 50 of us are going to make sure every park gets mowed. He's like, okay, let's say that works out for you guys and you don't, fall off and you guys pull that off. Who's going to clean the commodes in the park?
Yeah.
Well, no, not me. so,
Yeah.
so some of this stuff is like, it goes into that. It's like, well, if you don't pay taxes, no one's going to go clean the commodes in the parks. We're going to have to lock them shut, and then you won't have them anymore. And so,
Right.
yeah, there is some load of tax that we have to pay to maintain these things. We don't like that.
No, nobody likes that. But, you can think of it as a progress tax. We can think of it as this is, and that's, I think, some of the best money the government spends is, to do all this stuff. And I know it's not glamorous,
Right.
but it's absolutely critical. And you see it in, it's funny. You see it in my town government. Everybody wants to talk about something new and great, and of course they do. Nobody wants to talk about the potholes. Because that's boring.
Yeah.
But our people 50, 100 years have been keeping the roads going, and it's part of our task.
The things that we're supposed to do in Benicia, my hometown where I grew up, there is the standard Main Street theater from 100 years ago, and it's not derelict, but it's a step or two above that, and the owner doesn't want to do anything with it. And everybody in town, not everybody, but a lot of people in town bitch about, like, hey, we got to get that thing fixed up. And I'm like, listen, it's a big theater. What are you going to put in there? Are you guys going to go see movies? No one's even seeing movies in theaters anymore. You actually have to go. Someone has to spend millions of dollars to retrofit this place, make it safe, make it beautiful, make it modern.
Yeah.
And then you guys have to buy tickets because you're saying you want to do it. And they won't. I already know they won't. I could put on shows in that place right now because the guy will rent it out. But I don't think I could sell 100 tickets. And so I don't. And so this is part of that maintenance thing. The water main in our town coming into Benicia, not where I live now, but where I grew up, the about 5 miles up the road out of town from where we get our water broke. We broke in one of the storms. The rains came, mudslide, and it took out part of that thing. We had backup systems, but here's an evidence of, like, hey, this is a 40-year-old water main or whatever, and we have let it go and not looked at building up a reserve to deal with it. Okay, fine. Don't fix it until it breaks. Some things are maintained like that, but where's the money to maintain it? Well, I don't know. So that maintenance thing. How do you?
And here's a depressing fact. The U.S. government does these surveys, EPA in particular, about what's needed, and periodically they say this is what we need to fix up our water system, and it's more than $1 trillion of delayed maintenance.
Right.
Yeah.
$1 trillion. Oh my God.
Yeah. It's a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. It's crazy, right? Yeah. $1 trillion. Yeah. Jeez. Yeah. So when it comes to agriculture, is there a number like that where there's a deferred maintenance number?
It's different in agriculture. I mean, I think there is, but it's a different kind of deferred maintenance. And there's two types. There's sort of environmental, and it's less in the United States, but all over the world, people haven't irrigated properly, and that means when you do that, what happens is the water in irrigation has to flow. If it just sits there or stands there, I guess it could do either. It will evaporate. When it evaporates, whatever's in the water that's not water, usually some kind of salts, will just go right into the soil. And that's called salinization. And it's the reason that a lot of very old irrigated areas are actually not that great to grow things anymore. The Fertile Crescent, it's not so fertile anymore because of all the salt.
You're right. Yeah.
And so we have to do some kind of environmental remediation there. I don't know what percentage of it is, but part of the reason that part of Southwest Asia, the Middle East, is such a mess is because agricultural productivity isn't what it could be. In a big part of that is salinization. And there's other areas. There's a thing called compactification, which is we have these great machines, amazing machines that do the harvesting. I don't know if you've seen them out there, just monster combines and so forth. Well, they are so heavy, they mush down the soil where they go, and they crush the soil structure so that roots can't get in there, and soil and water can't migrate around in the soil. And so we have actually fairly large areas that are what they call compactified. And that's something we need to do. We have all the things with nitrogen I mentioned. So we have this kind of environmental maintenance that, and if we don't do it, it's going to catch up with us. And we're still in most places in the good part where it would, if we start paying attention now, it's not going to be an emergency. But the longer we delay on this, the better. The second kind of is what I would call social or something. So what happened when all these, new innovations were put into place? Farms became much more productive. And when they became more productive, it means that, more people produced more food. And some of those and all governments everywhere said, wow, let's get some of those people out of agriculture and into making stuff in factories and so forth. And so there's a great depopulation of rural places all over the world. You go into Iowa or South Dakota or something like that, and all these little towns have been hollowed out by this because we're so productive. We don't actually need those people just to grow stuff. A farm in Iowa that I spent some time on is just a guy and his son. His son works part-time. They have 1,200 acres of corn and wheat. Amazing high-line producers. There's just one guy there, 1.5 guys there. And so these towns have emptied out, and it's led to big social problems because not everybody can go. And the people who are there working, it's kind of lonely, right? And and it's not just the United States that we have them. You see these rural protest movements in France. You see them in the Netherlands. You see them in Spain, in Italy. You see them in India. I suppose we see them in China, but the news is so censored there. Who knows? But all over the world, these rural communities have been hollowed out, in part because of the sheer productivity of the farms, and it's led to tremendous social problems. And those guys, they need attention. All of us who don't live there depend on them, and they're getting a raw deal. So that's it's a weird way to think of maintenance, but that's maintenance are the things you have to do to keep the system going. And if we keep screwing up these rural communities, we're not going to be able to keep going. Also, it's just raw.
Again, going back to the baseball thing, I'll read an old baseball biography about somebody, and they barely get off the farm because the dad says something to him: "You can go, but understand, we're going to starve, because we need you here." And they weren't lying; they needed everybody. Because Rob, his brother, just had his arm taken off in the combine. And you're like, "Oh my God!" And so a lot of these careers never started because the person that maybe didn't want to be on a farm, had to stay because that's how they fed their, and not just the family, but the community. And so, that is a different thing today. That maintenance of that, Italy, France, you can go buy a farm for next to nothing because nobody wants to do that work. And it's idyllic in your brain, but then you go out there and you do the work and you're like, I'm too old.
And so, when you're going in, you can buy those farms. It's not so much that you're buying the farm, it's that you're buying the house, because the land has been sent off and has all been consolidated by guys, with more capital and this sort of thing. And eventually it all gets bought. There's one of the most depressing things that in this regard that I've ever seen was a project by the Nature Conservancy where they were trying to track who owns America's farmland. And they showed me a map of Iowa. This is, I don't know, 6 years ago now, so probably out of date. And what they showed was that a huge chunk, I couldn't tell you what percentage, but it was more than half of the best farmland in Iowa was now owned by by hedge funds and venture capitalists and Wall Street guys, essentially. Not farmers. And so not only were these communities being hollowed out, but even the people who were there, so they're essentially sharecroppers.
They're sharecroppers,
And I was looking at this thinking, this is not good. This is not a thing you want producing this is not the system you want producing your food. We need to fix this. So,
Boy, that's yeah. You're turning it like you're really making a class where someone's forced to stick in this thing, and maybe someone loves farming enough to stay, but not enough to have a shitty life.
yeah,
You don't want that.
yeah. No, I want people who are, after all, growing our food to have a good
Right.
life, and people who
Yeah,
are working there. I mean, they should get an honest day's pay, and and have some chance of advancement and all the things that I want for my kids.
sure. Yeah. When I've been talking with some friends about the YIMBY movement, where they
Hmm.
want to urbanize things and make things taller and more compacted. And they're often quite dismissive of the problem that you're illustrating. They're like, yeah, people will just grow food for us and that's how we'll live. Like, well, hold on. First off, there's a lot of competing systems in
Hmm.
that world, like how do you get enough fresh water there? How do you
Hmm.
maintain it? And we struggle when we start to stack systems into a community to have answers. So it's one
Yeah,
thing to say, I'm going to be a totalitarian. You all will ride the bus.
yeah,
But it's another thing to actually, like create a system that's balanced and look, you're always going to have problems, right? But a great example of this is UC Berkeley in
hmm,
Berkeley, the city, and so the city is struggling with like its growth, and they're kind of stuck in this mid-tier zone,
hmm,
and because the California and Massachusetts is probably a lot like this too. Everybody has rights, and so everybody can go to court. Everybody can gather into a group and say, "Hey, we're a bigger group. And we're going to go to court and be heard." And so, as you're trying to build the next thing or maintain things, someone's like, I need to
hmm,
go to court, right?" And so, our desire to ensure people's freedom is also a thing that ossifies very, very liberal people into conservative, not by politically, but they
yeah,
don't and can't change things. And it's a crazy thing. So here comes UC Berkeley, and they're like, congratulations, we've expanded our roster by 10,000 new students that we'd never had accounted before. And City of Berkeley's just on their hands and their knees breathing hard, like, we can't keep up with what we got. You can't
yeah,
bring 10,000 more people. And there's like these conflicting governmental goals
yeah.
within our own government of like, hey, let's try to figure out how to master what we have. And by the way, now we got to find 10,000 more beds. We don't
Hmm.
have them.
Right.
We need 10,000 hectares of water. We don't have it.
Yeah.
And there's nowhere to get it from. And so these problems grow and grow and grow. Now imagine Santa Cruz, which is hanging on the edge of the world, in a place with earthquakes and tidal waves. They're like, more students. And they're like, where are we going to put them? Like we can't expand the roads anymore. And again, Massachusetts probably has a lot of this. The code in Capitola and Santa Cruz, who are neighbor cities, it's so old that there are easements that are like this, where the house drains onto the other house, and
Wow.
there is no gutter. I mean, it is old and not going to change easy. And so there is no maintaining it.
Yeah.
Not at least not in a way that makes any sense. There's a lot of places like that have these, again, conundrums built in because it can't handle multiple systems of change.
Right. And there's different things going to work in different places, but we really, it's going to be bad news if we don't actually solve these. We have a smaller version of this where I live, the University of Massachusetts, which is a big engine of economic growth for Massachusetts. Its main headquarters, about a
Yeah.
mile away from where my wife teaches there. And, they're expanding, right? And they're expanding. It's good because it's more
Yeah.
opportunity for kids. It's
Yeah.
way cheaper than going to a private school.
Sure.
It's a pretty good school. My wife teaches there. She teaches architecture and design. There's a lot of kids who, work construction and then they want to improve themselves and, get better. It's a fabulous thing.
Yeah.
But the town has these kind of ossified things. It's very hard to build here because of my good neighbors.
Yeah.
And housing prices because of that are way higher than they should be. Not as bad as California, but it's the same kind of issue.
Fine. Yeah.
And
Right.
there's a bunch of things that need to happen. There needs to be a little pruning back on some of the opportunities to just randomly stop stuff. And we need to think about the reason for what they're doing, which is that people's entire net worth is bound up in their house.
Right.
And so when you're, saying I'm going to put more people here, they're fearful that their net worth is going to go down because there's going to be more people around, and it's a very visceral thing that's happening.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and here in California, we have a thing called Prop 13 that
Yeah.
protects, like, it makes your house a piggy bank. And so nobody's like, they brag about, like, I pay $48 a year because my grandfather, and you're like,
Yeah.
you can buy a bucket of paint for the city. At some
Yeah.
point, the city, look, I'm not as happy as anybody else to like, not like let the city waste money, but they need enough money to do the job. And so
Mhm.
we struggle with these thoughts. And in places like Massachusetts, California, wherever it is, we do have to deal with the fact that it costs money to do these things, and either we privatize stuff and pay the cost there, or we do that. And the other thing with taxes is when your house is a tax haven,
Mhm.
the government comes and taxes everything else, to include driving through their town, or
Yeah.
parking on a street, or and so when you take the tax safe haven away from the house, all the other taxes stay. And so now you're like, oh my God, like, what's left? And so, and I don't want to be unfair to anybody, but when a town says we're going to pass Measure F and that's going to
Mhm.
fix our roads, and then 10 years later the roads are in terrible shape and they never got fixed in the first place, and they're like, here comes Measure 15, we're going to fix our roads. They
Yeah.
remember that stuff.
Yeah.
People,
Yeah.
and I know you can think of examples, and nobody's trying to be a bad person, but there's not enough money to go around to do the things that we all want, and nobody wants to say no to anything. So that's
Right.
also another part of this maintenance conundrum, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. And I wish that I mean, in many, many places, people are too disengaged from these things until they see what's happening. And I understand why. Life is coming at you. We're constantly bombarded with
Sure.
stuff, but it's important for us to keep these fundamental systems going
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to improve them.
Yeah. How
And
likely is that to happen?
well, some of it definitely I think will happen. Some of it I'm very worried about. I'm the by and large the people who are in charge of agriculture are serious people who understand what they're doing. I think they could be get. It would be great if that was true of all the people in the government who they have to work for, but
Yeah.
what is there for agriculture? The big thing that worries me is the consumer. Us, we're so detached from the realities of these systems.
Right.
Beginning with the scale that's required to feed 8.2 billion people. Yeah, there's so many of us, and I sympathize who have this idea that we could do what we want to do with these sort of cute little farms like we have here in New England. I love the small farms in New England. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
Some down the street, they're just wonderful things. They're lovely people, but the system does not depend on them. They produce wonderful things, but the system depends on these giant enterprises that produce wheat and corn
Right.
and rice
Yeah.
and these things. Could they be less sort of gigantic corporate things that people are scared of? Yes, but that would require making it possible to break them up into smaller units that would be function economically, and that in turn would require a lot more labor, and that would require getting people to move out of the cities there. And the way you do that is by paying them, and it's
Right.
almost impossible to imagine how you could do that without food costing more. Or without having higher taxes to subsidize it or something. And
Right.
that's fine for, me, middle class guy. I can pay a little bit more for food, but, it's not fine for people who are struggling. And,
Right.
But at the same time, some of these people just like myself who are upset about, corporate farming and so forth, they don't realize that they are making it harder for people to have cheap food. They aren't really engaged in this in a serious way, and you see that all the time. People are saying like, "Oh, meat is bad," or there's this kind of projection of values onto this. which is, values are important, and I can see lots of right, and I can see lots of I can see lots of cases for us eating less meat that would make sense. There's certainly help. I had my former brother-in-law certainly didn't help himself when he had a quadruple bypass and went back to eating steak and potatoes every day.
Yeah.
Right. And there's too many of us. But the point is that none of this, really engages with the system as they are. And if we're going to make them better, we have to engage with them as they are and understand how they got built and why they got built that way.
Yeah, well, and again, like this, going back to this PhD that talked about the movement of food, that system is by its nature efficient because it has been winnowed, and things that didn't work have died off. Does it mean it can't be improved? No, of course. In vehicles, we move. It's just I talk with the train people all the time. And they love themselves from trains, but the problem is that it never works. They'll say it's more efficient. Yes, in this one little tiny circumstance right here, hyper efficient. But the whole thing matters, and they struggle with these thoughts. And I don't know if you're going to look at energy as a system, but energy is so important to everything we do. And we move more stuff on trains than anybody else in the world. And we're the best country at moving shit. We can put water in an airplane and make it make sense. We do all kinds of incredible things. But you have to convince the union, and I'm not against the union. You have to convince the union that it's to their advantage, the train union, to build a train. You have to convince the big fruit unions to say, it's a good idea to put Washington apples on trains. You have to convince. And all of a sudden you're like, you know what? Where's that pickup truck and that semi at? We'll just get this stuff moved because it's so hard to make these big wholesale changes. And then again, and I'd love to talk to you about energy once we get to that section. I don't want to get too far ahead, but these trade-offs that we have to do to have more trains, it takes a lot of effort politically, energy-wise, to dig up a bunch of perfectly good roads or in need of maintenance roads, to put down trains that also need maintenance. And I don't remember when I read this, and can't exactly get the quote right, but at one point, and it's just talking trains here for a second, the CTA, Chicago Transit Authority, owned more or leased and owned more cars than it had rail cars, and it's just like these weird things. And it's not because they're bad people. It's because, hey, we have to have cars to get around where there's not a train and do all these things. So, And so all of these systems struggle with the weight of their own maintenance needs or their own things that it takes to maintain them, And I'll say one more thing and I'll shut up. Out here in California, we get wildfires and we have to maintain our old wiring system for moving energy. And so that means you have to send two dudes out there in a bucket truck. Well, you can't send two dudes out 40 miles away from anything else by themselves. You need a third dude to be there just to keep things safe. Oh, and by the way, someone has to oversee that they're not making sure that they're not, whatever. And so they have to go weed whack the weeds down before they park their bucket truck thing in there. And it just becomes this crazy thing where to go maintenance these things, they can only do so many a day. They're so far out. It's so dangerous in terms of fire and falls and electricity that it is really, really expensive to go do that. It's easier just to go, no, they'll be fine, and just ignore it, because it's so hard. And we don't think about what it takes to put two linemen on a line 80 feet in the air and with a hospital nowhere near them, with no phone coverage.
And you guys in California have this big problem. You've had 100 years of fuel buildup, and so your woods are just, and fixing that. And here's something I would say, I guess it's part of my political propaganda. I think your governor has not focused on this. There's these charts that you see around of the acreage that they've done preventive burns on. And it's just not gone up very much during his term. Right. And it's easy to understand why. It's hard, just like you're saying. It's expensive. And there's tons of people going to sue you under the Clean Air Act for putting smoke in the air. But it's really needed. California has a giant wildfire problem. We actually know what the solution is. And the solution is making it as easy as possible to to maintain the woods, and that involves some money and some regulatory changes. You could model it on Florida. Florida has terrible wildfire issues too. All those longleaf pines, they just go up like that. But what they've got is a system there where essentially private landowners can very easily get permits to, burn land, and neighborhood associations and that sort of thing do it. And the taxpayers put into a fund, because every now and then something goes wrong, being human. And that fund pays for the damage if, it burns somebody's house or something like that. And they've had that system in place for 60 years, and it works like a charm. You don't hear of wildfire problems in, the Florida Panhandle, and that's why. And, California could really learn from that. Instead, in California, you have to hire, you've probably heard about this, the burn bosses. You have to hire a burn boss.
So many things.
Yeah, there's like a dozen of them in the state. They're a couple $1,000s a day. You have to have the big water tank. You have to have the crew. And that's for like an acre burn,
Right. Yeah. And that's just that part of it. This really happened. A dude's like, hey, I got to cut this old, I believe, oak tree out of my yard. And LA said, you're not cutting, that's a tree. That's a sacred animal.
Boy.
So they didn't say that, but that's how they treat it. And that tree fell on that dude and killed him.
Oh, wow.
And so now, instead of letting the guy cut the tree down, which of course professionals are going to come do, the family's going to sue the city for millions of dollars, And it's just like, it's so insane how we try to do these things. And so, I was actually going to ask you about, Donald Trump, the president right now, and he's talking about, hey, we have plenty of trees, and also we need to clear cut things, and also we need to, maintain these things. And look, you don't kind of like Donald Trump, but at least he's saying this. In California, I watched on the news, same news block, and you had one, and these guys are all like, Cal Berkeley. So these are not like Republican people. And the young guy goes, you absolutely must take away deadfall trees because it's fuel and it makes our fires go crazy. And then the very next guy with the very same credentials, who also works for the state, says you can never remove deadfall trees because they are part of the biosphere. And you can't do this. You can't do that and solve problems like that. So there is some kind of legal mechanism that we have to maintain freedom and everything else, but also like, how do we get discourse to be less discordant so that we can actually go forward? A friend of mine runs a thing called the Irvine Nature Conservancy, and they partner with over 30 different entities to do their stuff. And they're always getting this, where everybody wants to go in opposite ways. So I get it that it's hard and you don't want to make mistakes. And Lord knows we make a ton of them, but that I see as being one of the big problems is, and we're actually going to do a podcast about all this stuff. It'd be great to have you come on it sometime, but talking about how you manage things when you can't get these entities, and all of a sudden someone from US Ag shows up back, nope, that's my domain. And you're like, how do you, you're in outer space. Out of my line, US Ag has permanence in a lot of US outer space things, and so it's crazy. And again, it's all part of the system, but to maintain the system, you have to deal with these barriers that are very challenging to deal with.
Right. And, so the good thing though, is that these regulatory barriers that we're talking about, they're all human, so they can be solved. It's not like, actually a real big problem is, getting nitrogen out of soil. We don't know how to do that really. I think there's research going on. That's a hard problem, but, changing
or the salt, like you talked about in Iraq, where I walked.
That's a toughie.
You could. Oh yeah.
You can see it
not only is there oil, there's okay, so let's talk about the series real quick. So you've just has the agricultural one come out, or have I seen the draft?
Yes. No, that's what it's come out, and then next month comes the next one, which is on water systems, and that's the most frustrating one for me because we actually know how to make water systems, and we know how to provide clean water. And the fundamentals of it are really old. Mohenjo-Daro, which is, this ancient place in Pakistan, had a pretty good water system in 2500 BC. We actually know how to do this. And so the fact that so many of our water systems spring leaks and have bad water and so forth, man, that's on us.
Right.
There's no excuse.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, and so it's in the New Atlantis, everybody. If you
Yeah.
can look in the show notes, you can see the links there. There's a link in the remarks right now. So what's coming up and New Atlantis? Anything else we need to promote about this? And thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for talking about this. I love this stuff.
Well, I'm glad you do. My hope is, so this is really seriously. I said I would like there to be a course in this, or just more public awareness of these issues, because it's, if you open the front page of the newspaper or watch the TV news, it's never about the things that are fundamental to our existence. It's it's important what's going on in Ukraine or
Sure.
Doge or whatever.
Yeah,
but there could be a little space in there for the fact that something like a third of our cities lose more than half their water due to leaks, or whatever the exact figure is. I mean, that's crazy. Right. That's especially crazy. In a place. It's crazy in a place like Los Angeles to have large leak problems. It's crazy in a place like Philadelphia to have big leak problems.
Well, it's crazy in Benicia, which lives right on the edge of the water. They had a leaky fire hydrant out in our industrial park.
Yeah.
And the people who own that little hunk of land and work their business off it, but that's not our hydrant. That's your hydrant. And the city's like, no, it's not. And so that thing's just drip, drip, drip. And then they sent them, our water is very expensive in that hometown.
Yeah.
And so they sent them this massive bill for all the water. Like, no, that's your water leaking. That's your bill. That's not our bill. And so they had, and I don't know how they ever solved that, but this fire hydrant, Charles, it's not near anything. It's it's an old fire hydrant that doesn't like, maybe it needs to be there, but I don't know why, because it's not within 100 yards of anything.
A modern fire hydrant, even with the guys and everything, costs about $10,000 to put in and install, and that includes everything. Yeah. This is not huge. Somebody could do this.
Yeah. No, I believe you. It's doable, right? If we decide to do it. But these two groups, and I don't know how they resolved that, but they couldn't decide who owned the fire hydrant. And I can't blame a company for being, what do you mean I own the fire hydrant? If I do, then let's cap it off. I don't want it. Oh my gosh. All right. Anything before we wrap this up? Thanks again for coming on.
Oh, sure.
Have a great weekend and everything else.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's always fun to chat about things. I wish you well, and I wish your listeners well. And I'm sorry for inflicting my overt political propaganda on you.
I love it. Everybody, this is Charles Mann. Look, you can find him on X. He's always on there interacting with stuff. For sure, go to the New Atlantis and check out these articles. It's fantastic stuff to think about, and super heady and Cajun. I appreciate you doing it. Can't wait to have you on for the next one. Everybody, have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.